Anu Bradford, very warm welcome to the Digital Markets Research Hub. I'm grateful for your time, and we will be talking today primarily on your new book, Digital Empires, and it is a very impactful book which has been recommended by several leading publications or ranked at the top level, and people talk about this book. I wanted to use this opportunity and maybe to ask more specific questions about regulating digital markets, or rather regulating competition in digital markets in the European Union and UK. But let us start with just clarifying the terminology. You coined the phrase digital empires. We also hear some academics in legal literature, EU law academics, start using this vocabulary of empires. So it's probably not coincident. So can you please provide to us the basic definition of digital empires, and maybe you can explain to us the topology, why you listed the three?
Very good. So Oles, thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to share this conversation with you. So the notion of empires, I use the term metaphorically. So it is not meant to infer direct parallels to historical empires, but I think conceptually it's helpful for us to understand what is going on in the domain of digital regulation. So in the book, I argue that there are three primary ways to think about governing the digital economy. There is the American market-driven model, there is the Chinese state-driven model, and there is the European, what I call a rights-driven model. But why I call these three leading technological and regulatory powers empires? Because none of them have the regulatory model that is just confined to the domestic jurisdiction. Instead, each digital empire is proactively exporting its respective regulatory model abroad, and in that process, expanding one sphere of influence. But interestingly, Oles, they are all exporting something different. So the United States is primarily exporting the private power of its tech companies. So the US tech companies are everywhere. They were set free to grow and take over the world. So you have companies like Meta's Facebook that is present in 160 jurisdictions, that is used by 3 billion people around the world. So that is part of the American digital empire. The Chinese digital empire is primarily a function of the Chinese infrastructure power. So Chinese tech companies are building 5G networks and data centers and undersea cables, smart cities, safe cities, and expanding their digital infrastructure along what is known as the digital Silk Road that reaches across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even parts of Europe. So then the question is, what are the Europeans exporting? What is the superpower that the Europeans have, which today is regulation? So the Europeans are not only writing digital regulations for the European market, they are also exporting those regulations through the phenomena that I described in my earlier book, the Brussels effect. So the EU is one of the largest and wealthiest consumer markets in the world, and very few global companies can afford not to trade in the EU. So as the price for accessing the European market, they need to comply with European regulations, including these extensive digital regulations. But often these companies decide that it's in their interest to extend that European regulation across their global conduct or their global production. And this way, they are expanding the European regulatory influence across the global arena. So in this way, Oles, we basically have the three overlapping digital empires present in many third markets, because each empire is contributing a different layer to the digital ecosystem. We have many markets where you see US tech companies, Chinese infrastructure, and European regulations present at the same time.
And obviously, we understand that each classification, each typology requires some, you cannot create a map with landscape one-to-one. Of course, you need to simplify, and you need to distinguish specific features. When we talk about three empires, do you think it covers sufficiently all the emerging super powers, like India, for example, or some conglomerates in some parts of the world, or Taiwan, or maybe some other jurisdictions which probably offer hybrid elements or contain some hybrid elements from all three, or maybe two of the three. Do you classify them under kind of the fourth way, or they just how do you treat them?
Yeah, it is a good question, Alice, because the world obviously is simplified if you believe that there are only three relevant jurisdictions. So the book argues that there are three primary models that we see shaping the global digital economy. But that doesn't mean that every other state is powerless or completely at the mercy of these three digital empires. Many small states are. They are not able to necessarily carve out their own vision for the digital economy. They are dependent on US tech companies, Chinese infrastructure. They don't have their own regulatory capacity, so they often rely or even free ride on European regulations. But you mentioned, for instance, India, and I think that is a really interesting country to look at. India is large. It is a rather capable regulator. It has pursued a lot of digital regulations, and it has also technological capabilities. So India is one of those that I would say that is strategically choosing which elements of each empire it is adopting in shaping its own digital market. So if you look at India's approach to data privacy, it very much emulates many aspects of the European GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. But then it includes very strong data localization requirements, which is directly borrowed, or at least similar to the Chinese data localization requirement. So that has elements of a state-driven influence in the Indian data protection regulation. India is also somewhat, it's questionable probably for some, whether India should be thought of as a true democracy that is very committed to the rights-driven model, given some of the developments under the Modi regime, where the protection of minorities is certainly not has been a priority for the government. Where there's a lot of censorship online as well. So there are many reasons to sort of suggest that India is indeed what you use the word hybrid, and that it selectively sort of engages with various empires. It certainly is not willingly sort of subjecting itself to the Chinese empire. India has been quite tough in cracking down on the presence of many Chinese apps in the Indian market. So I think that is one of the great test cases, and would be a really nice follow-up for somebody after the digital empires to delve into and look at and really tell us the story about the details of India.
Indeed, and I had few opportunities quite recently to engage with their stakeholders who plan to adopt something similar, which European Union has and UK with regulating competition in digital markets. And you can see how big the stakes are there, and how enthusiastic they are, and different stakeholders, how enthusiastic they are in promoting different narratives, so to say. But coming back to the European Union and UK, putting it as Europe, we understand that the new wave of regulatory enthusiasm or proactive approach to to regulating competition in digital markets is underpinned by the idea, if we use the vocabulary or the ethos of the book, that being an empire is an important feature, is being a trendsetter, and thus having an ability to accumulate most of the benefits from the rest of the world copying you or trying to take in you as a navigator, so to say. So I wonder if the role of Europe of being a kind of human rights centric moral compass for the world, showing to the rest of the world examples of privacy-focused, human rights minded legislation, but also from technical point of view as well, being very mature and refined. Is it sufficient for European Union and for Europe as UK and EU to nurture and to promote their digital future, so to say? And my hidden question is Is it a shortcoming for can you be an empire without having EU tech?
So I certainly would like to see a more ambitious and more successful Europe when it comes to not just regulating technologies, but developing these technologies. So that's somewhat different question to me, whether the EU can be an empire. The EU can still have significant influence over the digital market simply by regulating those digital markets. It can still shape what we are producing, what we are consuming, what our technological development looks like, as long as the companies do adjust their conduct to the European regulations. But that doesn't mean that the Europeans should be comfortable just saying that, okay, we are the referees. We don't care about playing the game. We don't care about winning. I think the Europeans should really get on the field and play the game and play offense and play defense and play it well. So the question is then whether that is, what would that take for the Europeans to do that? And there is this common notion that the Europeans need to choose. Either they regulate or they innovate. And that to me is not a particularly helpful framing, because it is not the digital regulations that, in my view, are holding Europeans back. It is possible for a country to be very committed to the rights-driven model, protect the fundamental rights of users, their privacy, make sure that the content moderation online will not tolerate hate speech or disinformation, leverage the antitrust powers to discipline the dominance and the abusive conduct of big tech companies. But there is more that the EU needs to do to make sure that alongside of regulating, it creates the kind of tech ecosystem where tech companies can thrive. So there's a much to be done that have little to do with digital regulation. So one is that there is still an incomplete digital single market in the EU. It is very hard for tech companies to scale across 27 different member states. The second is funding. It is still much harder for European tech companies to fund their innovations in the EU. There's not the similar kind of thriving venture capital market that the US tech companies based in the US are able to tap into. So again, if we were ambitious about completing the capital markets union and making sure that there is a much deeper, robust capital market that will be funding European innovations, that would certainly help. A third issue, if I may add, is that the Europeans don't really have the kind of mentality or legal frameworks in place that would encourage risk-taking. So the many European countries have punitive bankruptcy laws, which means that if an entrepreneur tries to do something really disruptive, which we want our entrepreneurs to do in the tech space, if they fail, they often find that failure to be fatal. It is very hard for them to go and raise funding afterwards. Whereas in the US, a failure is almost like a rite of passage in Silicon Valley. You try, you occasionally fail, that's built into the model of venture capital. Then you get more money so that you can try again. So the US model allows for the second chance. That is also one part of explaining their success. And the fourth issue is that for the Europeans to also become the key innovators, they do need to have access to the world's best talent, the way that the Americans do. So there needs to be a proactive immigration policy, which then attracts the global talent to the EU. So if you look at, for instance, over $1 billion startups in the US, over 50% of those have an immigrant founder. And I think that is an important part of how that immigration and diversity and global human talent has really been fueling the US innovation ecosystem. So all these, I would like to be on an urgent agenda for the European policymakers so that the Europeans are not just the referees, but they are also an empire of technologies.
Do you think it's even doable?
Whether it's doable, I think in terms of some parts of that, building the digital single market, that's the core of what the Europeans do. They have an incredible track record in building a single market. In many ways, that has been very successful, and that is the source of the European power. So that is within the competence of the European lawmakers. That should not be the hardest thing to do, because that's at the heart of what the European Union is about. So many of those items are more controversial, or they are harder politically capital markets union has been in the making for a long time, yet it remains woefully incomplete. Bankruptcy laws also get into this question of very different corporate law structures across the member states. Again, probably hard, but if you want to grow your economies, if you want to create European innovations, it's not that you should avoid trying to do hard things. It is not impossible to do. The same idea about migration. There is unfortunately a sort of negative cultural narrative and a more parochial narrative, which is sort of more anti-immigration in many countries. But there needs to be an honest conversation of the economic necessity for Europeans to take in immigrants at all levels to deal with the demographic crisis, but also the real high-end skilled immigration that is crucial for innovation and the economic future of the entire European economy.
Okay, Anu, we have commented on the vision of Euro optimists, let's say, people who are keen to promote European Union tech market, tech industry to the utmost level. There are also those who say that, who are on more skeptical side, who say that it is, in order to scale up these days, you either need to have a huge market, more or less homogeneous, or also or in addition, maybe you can decrease the ethical standards, the benchmark of appropriateness, which are being tolerable by some society. And here we have huge discrepancy, because some jurisdictions can free ride on either ignorance or suppressing their societies, extracting a lot of data 24/7, continuously monitoring each digital step of each individual, and then doing pretty much ruthless experimentations with data, etc. And that's, we know how algorithms are being trained, how pharmacological sector has been trained 100 years ago. There are some parallels with how we train the algorithms. So do you think this objective, purely neutral observation about the more the better, so to say, would give a competitive advantage to those jurisdictions vis-a-vis those who are more ethically mindful and constrained?
So there, I definitely advocate the position that the Europeans need to build their technological capabilities and pursue innovations that is consistent with European values, and exploiting users' data with the view of creating the kind of tech giants that the Europeans are already very uncomfortable with. That should not be the European goal. So if we don't like Google's model of surveillance capitalism, why would we try to replicate what the Americans are doing there? Even if we know that more data you have, the better you can then build large language models, which will help you in generative AI. Do we really want to have the kind of surveillance society? And I think the answer is clearly no. The same way that we are not willing to exploit the environment and accept the deterioration of our environment, even if that provided us sometimes the economic advantage. And I would like to think, Oles, that also the values of consumers, what consumers and users and citizens want, that is also shifting. And the European regulatory model is attentive to that shift. I think the users want to have the benefits of AI that is also ethical, that they can trust. The same way that the users increasingly also want privacy-enhancing features in the product. So it is not that you need to accept the kind of economic innovations or market-based innovations that would be contrary to the kind of social innovations that you also want to see in the society. So the idea that there must be a way to think about regulation as not stifling innovation, but changing the pathways for innovation, dedicating those capabilities and innovative resources into developing the kinds of digital products and services that are both innovative in terms of they can generate tremendous profits for companies, but also that are socially acceptable and consistent with our values.
Okay, and if you look at at the wide scope of different digital industries, we can clearly see some where European companies were trendsetters, or maybe they have initiated, they launched these industries, and they were actively present. Let's say in telecommunication market, we hear this argument more and more often these days. And then the focus was shifted towards prices, or maybe some access to universal access to these services, rather than trying to promote it across the globe, so to say. And we witnessed a slowing down of those industries. They are not anymore trendsetters. They are still within the group of those who are decisive, so to say, with next generation. But each generation, we see that their impact is decreasing. Obviously, one can say that it's normal. In some industries, it's other way around. So there is no regularity about these processes. But if there is so I'm asking, if there is a regularity in your view, if there is critical mass of such European companies in different digital sectors, and if the answer is yes, is it a systemic problem?
If we focus on digital infrastructures, you mentioned 3G, 4G, 5G, 6G, it is true that China has really moved on to be a global leader in building those infrastructures. And in many ways, the Europeans and Americans find themselves now in the situation that China is not just providing infrastructures for itself, but really across the world. So this is when I earlier mentioned the digital Silk Road and the expansion of the Chinese empire through infrastructure building. And it is rather difficult today for the Europeans to respond to that Chinese competitive challenge, because what the Europeans say is that we cannot compete on the level playing field. The Chinese companies benefit from the kind of political support of the Chinese the government, and the economic support when Chinese government is willing to back these deals with the kind of financing that is not available for European governments. So Chinese infrastructure is pretty good, and it is much cheaper. And if you try to then persuade the developing countries to turn down the Chinese infrastructure without offering them an alternative that they can afford, it is really hard to think why these countries would abandon their economic engagement and their partnership with Chinese companies. So in that sense, the challenge today for Europeans and Americans is that they are competing with state-sponsored companies. And it is no longer the kind of free market where the most competitive companies necessarily can compete on merits. And that has sort of fueled this conversation that do we actually need to respond to Chinese subsidies by extending our own subsidies and making sure that we are not reliant on Chinese infrastructures or other technologies. And now partially you see both the US and China in many domains resort to subsidies, whether we think about AI, quantum computing, whether we think about semiconductors in particular. And the question is whether that game is winnable and whether it is even worth playing.
That's the question. What's the answer?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's an easy answer, Ole. So the idea is that you can try to subsidize yourself to the point where your products are competitive, but at some point we're going to run out of money. So I don't think the Europeans are able to, if you think about even just the subsidies when it comes to semiconductors, we're spending over 40 billion to be no longer 90%, but 80% dependent on foreign technologies. And there's just a lot of, that's not the only domain where we feel that there are vulnerabilities. So rather, I'm going back to what I said, what it would take to build the European capabilities and more competitive European companies so that there is more innovation and there's more growth. I don't think industrial policy is the answer. That doesn't mean that we need no role for the state. We do need, there's a very good conversation by people like Marianne Mazzucato on entrepreneurial state. And the state has been behind many of the early US innovations. But we cannot just think about turning to a state-driven economic model and play Beijing's game and expect somehow that that is the path toward the growth of European tech sector. I just don't believe that is the answer.
All right, and we see that European public authorities show remarkable enthusiasm with new steps with regulating digital economy and digital society, but because we are mainly focused on competition, so we are mainly interested in digital markets. But obviously there is a catalog of other acts, EU acts, which in one way or another will contribute to shaping the future of European digital markets. So I wonder what, and in particular, those which will be trying to regulate foreign subsidies, among other things, which you have mentioned as well. So I wonder, do you support, what are your views on this new wave of EU regulation for digital market? Do you support it? Do you find it suitable to the challenges and opportunities of today and tomorrow?
So in many ways, I think the new wave of digital regulations, where we could think about the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, now soon to be adopted, AI Act, it is a response of the Europeans taking a hard look at what have we done up until now, and has that really worked? And I think the answer for many is that it may have had some impact, but it certainly leaves a lot to be desired. And the regulations that have been in place, or the legal frameworks, the enforcement tools that have been in place, have been inadequate in delivering the kind of market, the kind of digital market that would be consistent with protecting the European rights. And if you look at competition law specifically, 10 billion in fines against Google, has that really done much to shift its market position? And the answer is no. So the fines seem to be just for these companies a price for doing business in the EU. They're happy to pay as long as they don't need to change their business models. It also has been very time consuming to try to bring these cases, gather the evidence, and then go through multiple steps for appeals, which is obviously a part of how rule of law works in our societies. But I think in many ways, there was a recognition that the existing arsenal just was not sufficient in its enforcement. The same thing with the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. Very influential law on paper, but we have seen often rather modest enforcement. So right now, this new set of regulations, in particular the DMA and DSA, reflect this notion that we do need to act faster, we need to act more forcefully, we need to target the actual business models of these companies if we are expecting to see any change. And I think here the question is that, and it's still, the jury is still out. We don't yet know whether these regulations will actually make a difference. But I think they certainly represent a different approach towards governing the digital economy. And it is a real test case of whether the European rights-driven regulatory model can deliver in practice.
But do you think that those who will be enforcing this very discretionary rules, which allow wide room for interpretation, do you think that their enforcement philosophy or their understanding of things should be comparable to the previous one, where you as a caseworker, you would be focused only on achieving this narrow goal, or you have to be also underpinned, driven by other broader societal interests of European Union? Because the room for interpretation and the room for selecting cases or selecting instances of non-compliance, it will be incomparably wider with the new wave of regulation than with the previous one. And thus, you have to explain, at least for yourself, why you have selected case A rather than case Z. And thus, something else might be also than purely neoclassical, neutral neoclassical price theory should steer your decision, or it would be against the neutrality which is part and parcel of regulatory of good regulatory governance.
Yeah, so I think you laid out correctly that there will be choices that need to be made in terms of priorities. I think we are at the moment when the tech companies are making important choices. They cannot afford to contest and litigate everything. They are not going to object to every provision of the DMA or every provision of the DSA. They simply can't afford to do that. So if you are a company like Meta and you are at the same time facing the European privacy regulators, You are facing the competition regulators. You have the AI Act that is directly applying to you. You have the Digital Services Act. And each of those are tackling your business model from many different directions. I think you are a repeat player, and you sort of cannot afford but not to engage with the regulators. So they will be conceding some of those battles. And I think that's one of the things that I'm watching with great interest, is that which are the ones that they are actually conceding and which ones are they combating with litigation. And I don't think there's going to be a uniform response across all the companies. Some of them make a different strategic decision how combative how they want to come across versus how much they want to show good faith effort to comply. But you're absolutely right. If you look at the powers that now have been vested with the Commission is making hard choices. It is not at the same time trying to insist and pursue on every company across every provision. Of course, the ideally, we would see the deterrent effect, and we would see the regulations to be self-enforcing. I don't think they are going to be across all the domains, and where they are not, there will be strategic decisions on which ones to contest. But even under the old regime, it wasn't that the Commission was pursuing every single case. We've always had an administrative model that entails discretion. And the question is, how objective does that discretion need to be? I think in many ways, to preserve your authority or credibility or legitimacy, you need to choose the cases that you're going to win. And you need to choose the cases where the limited resources at your disposal are going to bring the greatest net benefit to the society. So in many ways, I think we are going to see the same kind of calculus, that there's a probability of not being defeated in the courts if the case is being litigated. But also then the question is that if we really want to achieve the outcome, meaning less concentrated digital market, more choice for the consumers, greater fairness, or a online space under the DSA that features less disinformation or harmful hate speech, what are the provisions that we are going to focus on in order to get as close as we can towards that outcome?
And you mentioned also regulatory dialogue, which probably will be less litigious, more participatory mode of trying to find this workable compromise. We hear this often also from people representing different stakeholders, by the way. My last question, before asking the traditional one, recommendation to students, I noticed in your book a point where you were saying that we were illusioned or naive, optimistically naive, which is a good, healthy condition, of course, about on the eve of the internet, that internet is a kind of a synonym of freedom, and what kind of censorship you can think of when everything will be so approachable, and it will be the end of history in many senses. It coincided with the vision of end of history. Now we realize that it never ends, and that internet is perfectly instrumentable, or it can be instrumentalized by different ideologies, starting from the most liberal and ending with to the most totalitarian even. But you have noted also that there are some elements which supposedly will not be digested by authoritarian internet governance. And you have mentioned as an example generative AI hype. Do you think that this technology, which for many appears to be the future of, or a significant step in the development of internet, is not easily copyable by simply holding sufficient scale and computational power? You need something else which is missing, you cannot replicate technically.
So what does it take to be a major developer of generative AI? So you do need to have a lot of data, because the more data you have, the better are the models, the large language models, when you can feed more inputs into those models. But we've also noticed, and this is a big reason behind the escalating tech war around the chips, is that you need computing power in order to develop and run these models. So you need those chips that allow you then to have the hardware infrastructure in place. But you also need a lot of talent. So in general, this is not something that is very simple to actually develop. It may be that it becomes accessible for many to use these models and have different ways to apply the generative AI, but actually to develop it, you do need a lot of talent. And then you need to have the institutions that are able to really adopt and sort of adopt when they have access to this technology. So in that sense, the generative AI is still replicating many of the power structures we have in today's digital economy, which is a function of the internet revolution. So the current front runners, the platforms that dominated the internet revolution, are the ones who have access to that data. They are the ones who have the talent. They can afford the computing power, what it takes to develop these models. So in that sense, I think that the generative AI is not necessarily changing the way we think about the digital economy and its governance. If anything, it is entrenching some of the existing dominance structures and making it even more imperative for competition agencies to try to check in the power of these big tech companies.
Thank you very much, Anu. My last question is, we know how successful in terms of producing more and more impactful research you are, and you are also active as a public speaker. You communicate, you participate in academic discussions, so you do a lot. So your recommendation to our students would be really of high value.
Well, I think, Oles, the key is to really do what you enjoy doing, and thinking about choosing the research projects that give you the greatest joy. And this book was, in many ways, it was an attempt to write the book not of what I know, but what I wanted to know. So I was not an expert of all these domains of digital regulation that I set out to write. And I certainly wasn't a China expert. I am a comparativist, and I have written about China, but obviously my knowledge of the EU is much deeper than my knowledge of China. But it was a wonderful challenge to embrace. I read so much about China. I leveraged these incredible Chinese students who were my research assistants. I talked to very generous China scholars who read the draft. So in many ways, the answer there would be not to be afraid and take on the big challenges, because that is a very gratifying way to do research. Because just the joy of daily realizing how much you are learning was just extremely gratifying. And I think ultimately it was more gratifying than just writing up what I already knew. So it was really sort of be led by your curiosity and don't be deterred by the idea that some part is challenging, because there certainly is a way. And it is also the way that is particularly joyful, because it entails many more conversations with people that otherwise you would not have expanded. So now I feel I have a whole field of the scholarship that I can enjoy and consume and be part of, and also then engage with those individuals who taught me a lot about China. So that's probably one. Maybe then I share the other one, is that I think as an academic, there's an opportunity cost to everything that you write and everything that you do. And I think you need to ultimately decide that what is really important and what is the time you need to protect. And if you want to write books or big papers, you really need to protect that time. And find it, these books don't get written between 2:30 and 3:30 in the afternoon when you find an hour. And I had a hard time finding that time. I have 3 kids, I'm teaching, there's a lot of things that are going on. So I decided for 2 years when I was writing, I woke up at 4:30 every morning and I started writing at 4:45. So before I even got the kids up, there were 2 hours of digital empires that already were written. And it sets you off really well for the day. And it's often during those 2 hours, I wrote much more than I wrote in the course of the rest of the day. So I think in many ways, some people find it's late at night. Some people find that it's in the mornings. The Brussels effect, it was Saturday mornings that I blogged. But there needs to be something that you blog that is really just for your time alone, with your thoughts, with that reading, with that process of writing. And that can be very, very gratifying in the end.
Anu Bradford, thank you very much indeed for sharing your great ideas with all of us.
Thank you so much for having me, Oles. It was a pleasure.